All right, Alexander, let's talk about the war that is underway. We are in a world war. Uh, it is a world war, correct? Would you
Absolutely.
describe it as a world war, real quick?
A-
Yeah, or a
Absolutely. I
European
mean,
war?
it is right. I mean, obviously, the center of this war is in Europe, but it is having international, global ramifications. There's conflict in the Pacific. There's fighting in Africa, because of course the Germans have colonies in Africa. The British are waging war against those colonies. We're now seeing submarine warfare. Germans are launching submarine warfare to interfere with the British merchant marine. And of course, we're now hearing rumblings in the United States that it might be drawn into the war as well. So this is absolutely a world war. It hasn't yet perhaps reached the full global dimensions that I suspect it will, but already there is fighting going on all over the world.
Before we get into the main video talking about Russia and its participation in the war and how things are going, which is not too good, why would the U.S. want to enter this war? Just real quick.
Very,
I mean,
very
I don't see a
question.
reason for them to enter. Do
No,
you?
no. And that's, of course, what many, many people in the United States are saying. In fact, I'm going to make a guess. I suspect if most people in the United States, American voters, had a vote on this, they would probably overwhelmingly vote to stay out. As far as they're concerned, this is a war between other countries. They're not directly involved. There are many, many Americans of German descent who sympathise with Germany. There's others who sympathise with Britain. But most people, I think, in the United States would rather that the United States stayed out. But we are starting to see emerge in the United States some very, very powerful forces which want the United States to achieve a kind of global position, a kind of globalist foreign policy, if you like, and they are closely allied to forces in Britain, which have been looking to try and enlist the United States as an English-speaking country to perpetuate, if you like, the the British system of global control. The British were quite open about this, by the way, in the years leading up to the First World War. The British were going out of their way to develop links with the American elite, particularly the business elite, but also the political elite. One of their most prominent people in Britain, Cecil Rhodes, set up the Rhodes Scholarships to get members of the American elite educated in British universities. And you can see that this group is becoming increasingly influential in the United States and is trying to win over people in the United States. Now, there's enormous resistance. It's far from clear as of yet that it's going to succeed. But unfortunately, the British are always lucky with their adversaries, with the Germans, who seem to be working slowly towards a situation where they're going to help the British by taking steps against the United States, which will probably assist those forces in the United States that want to involve the United States in the war against Germany. Already the United States, by the way, is supplying arms to the French and the British. So you can already see that sort of involvement beginning to develop. And you're beginning to see in the United States the beginning of military industries, a military industrial complex, if you wish. It's still in a very, very early stages. But of course, from their point of view, a war is exactly what they would like.
All right, and real quick, one more question. Italy, just a few months back, as 1915 was rolling or was getting into full swing with the war, they kind of, I don't know if it's a surprise, but they did enter the war, but not on the side of Germany and Austria. What do you
Well,
make of that? I mean,
well,
Russia was hoping that Italy would enter the war in order to open up another front, and if you look at the geography, you can understand why that would be beneficial to the Allies. But does it surprise you that Italy took this decision to go against its traditional ally in Germany. It has had tensions with Austria and Hungary with regards to the Balkans, so I can see how Italy felt left out and bypassed by the decisions taken between Germany and Austria. But what to make of that? And then we'll roll into, I think it's a good segue to talk about Russia as well, because Russia was hoping that Italy would make this decision in the Allies' favor. And sure enough, we got that.
Absolutely. Now, it's important also to say that Russia and Italy have very good relations. They're very friendly countries to each other. They found themselves in opposite alliances, but there's never been any anti-Russian feeling in Italy, at least not of any significant degree. And of course, the Russians have a long history of interaction with Italy. But why did Italy switch sides? Well, the short answer is because of the catastrophic way in which the Germans mismanaged the diplomacy in 1914. We discussed that in our previous programme. It's obvious to anybody who is following things closely that there were people in Berlin and Vienna who were looking for a war. Italy had never signed up to a war, a European war, when it entered into an alliance with Germany and Austria, a war of that kind. They were completely cut out of the discussions. They felt, in effect, betrayed by what the Germans did, and they didn't understand why they should be drawn into a war because an Austrian archduke had been assassinated in the Balkans in extremely shady circumstances, some of which beg some serious questions about policy in Vienna, and they didn't see why they should be drawn into a war on the German side, given the reckless policies the Germans were following in provoking a war against Russia and France, and also eventually Britain. Bear in mind, it was the Germans who declared war on Russia and the Germans who declared war on France. They took the initiative to declare war. And again, the Italians, inevitably began to beg the question, why? Now, why did the Italians join the Allies? I think the Italians have made a very tough-minded calculation. I think they believe the Allies are going to win. The Western powers are going to win. I think ultimately, by the way, they're going to be right. So the Italians want to be on the winning side. They don't feel any sense of loyalty to a former ally, Germany, which betrayed them. And of course, they have territorial claims against Austria. They want control of the area known as Trentino, which, by the way, is largely populated by Germans, and they also want control of the important port city of Trieste, which is predominantly Italian-speaking, but which is still ruled by the Austrians. So the Allied powers were able to come along, say to the Italians that, if you go to war on our side, you will win these things. We're going to win this war in the end. The Germans have taken leave of their senses. They've started this war, this world war, recklessly and without good cause. We are reliable. We are your true friends. France played an instrumental role back in the 1850s and 1860s in creating, in unifying Italy, creating the Italian state. You have that long-standing connection to France. Much of your elite speaks French as their preferred language. So we are your natural allies against the Germans who have so profoundly and completely let you down.
Italy was neutral. They were taking a neutral stance as this was all kicking off. But I just have to ask you this question, which kind of bothers me. It makes me curious. Not bothers me. I'm just curious about it. When you look at the geography, if you were Germany, you would realize that you need Italy on side. I mean, the Russians realized that. I mean, you look at the map and you say, okay, here's your southern flank. If whoever gets Italy on side has a big advantage here.
Absolutely.
How come the Germans didn't realize that? I mean, did they not see that if you lose Italy, you lose your whole southern position?
Well, German diplomacy sucks, to say it straightforwardly. They made no real attempt to keep people in Rome happy, to keep them out of the war. I've said that the Germans are mismanaging their relations with the United States. They're behaving in extreme arrogance towards the United States. They're, by the way, already starting to take steps to try to win over Mexico as a counterbalance against the United States. I mean, unbelievably foolish ideas. And they missed the ball. They dropped the ball disastrously with Italy as well. I should say that Italy is in the throes at the moment of a nationalist movement as well, which takes a very strong anti-Austrian form, not so much an anti-German form, but an anti-Austrian form. There's a lot of talk about in Italy about Trentino and Trieste being part of Italy, and that Italy can't afford to stay out of the war, and that Italy must show its martial vigor and demonstrate its Roman its Roman heritage. And there's a very, very brilliant, very vocal journalist, a former socialist, by the way, a man called Benito Mussolini, who is incredibly active in whipping up all of this in Italy. So, I mean, this is not to be discounted. I mean, there is a popular move in Italy to try and become involved in this war. There's even, people, Italian poets who are writing about this sort of thing. But ultimately, as I said, it was the fact that the political class in Rome felt bitterly let down by the Germans, felt the Germans had ignored them and disregarded their interests. And here were the French, the British and the Russians coming along, pointing out to the Italians, look, we're going to win this war in the end. It's in your interests to be on the winning side. You can win significant territories against the Austrians, all these territories that you have long-standing claims to. Join us. This is your moment. So all of this has come together, and that's why Italy joined the Allied side instead of the German. And the bizarre thing, what is really strange about this, is that not only does one get this sense that nobody in Berlin was prepared for this possibility, nobody in Berlin even seems to have thought about it, which is really very, very strange. And they don't even seem to care very much. They don't seem to realize that Austria, which we're going to come to, discussing Russia, is becoming extremely beleaguered indeed. It's now facing a crisis in the Balkans because it's not succeeded in winning the war in Serbia. That proved to be far more difficult than the Austrians had expected. It's going to now be bogged down in another front with Italy. And of course, as we're going to discuss, it's facing an existential crisis because of the steady advance of the Russian military into the heart of the Habsburg Empire. So it demonstrates again the staggering lack of German strategic judgment and the arrogance and incompetence of German diplomacy.
Okay, so we've set it up really nicely. Italy has joined. Big win for the Allies. There are rumblings that the U.S. may be looking to join, though I still can't figure out why or what would prompt the U.S. to take this on. But who knows? The news, it changes day by day, and everything is moving very, very quickly. So we will see exactly what happens with the United States. But should the U.S. Find a reason to enter, or should a reason be made for the U.S. to enter, then obviously that would be a big game-changing event. You're confident that the Allies will win. How is Russia doing in all of this? Because I've heard some successes, but also some big defeats. What's going on with Russia?
Right. Well, let's talk about Russia, because of course Russia is in some ways the key decisive player in all of this. Now, it's important to say that the entire focus of Western media commentary is on the fighting on the Western Front, the fighting between Germany and Britain and France, with the German army occupying most of Belgium and large areas of northern France, and having in 1914 tried to march on Paris itself, and they were turned back at the last moment. Now, so most of the focus is on that, but in some ways, the more difficult and important fight is the fight in the East, in Eastern Europe. And here it's important to say that this is a war on multiple fronts. And Russia is waging this war on multiple fronts. It's waging the war against Germany, it's waging a war against Austria, and it's also waging a war very successfully in the Caucasus against Turkey. So Russia's having to fight on three fronts at once. It is a very large army, and parts of that army are extremely good. And some of its generals are extremely skilled and very, very effective and very talented. But that is already overstretching them, even allowing for the fact that the German army, most of the German army, or large parts of the German army, have to be concentrated against the West, in the West against the British and the French. So already you can see that the Russians, very much like, you remember we talked about Mr. Duran, the former interior minister, he warned the Tsar before the war that if there was a war against Germany, it would be Russia that would have to do the heavy lifting. Well, you can see that it is already the case that that is happening. Now, the problem is that though parts of the Russian army are very good and are doing actually a very creditable job of fighting this war, there are major dysfunctions on the domestic front, on the home front, and there are also problems at the highest levels of command. Now, let's talk about the high command of the Russian army. If you remember, in our last program, we discussed how Nicholas himself is the Tsar. He is the person who is supposed to be in overall charge of the Russian army. But in fact, because of the divisions within the imperial family, and because of the very powerful influence of the liberals in the Duma, the Russian parliament, and within the business community on the part of the oligarchs, he's had to share control of the army, the military, with his cousin, the great prince, Nikolai Nikolaevich. And Nikolai Nikolaevich has been the commander-in-chief. He is very close to the liberals. He's very close to certain people in the Duma. He's close friends, so it seems, with the Speaker of the Duma, a man called Rodzianko, and he's also close friends with the former Speaker of the Duma, a man called Guchkov. And it's fairly widely known that Nikolai Nikolaevich doesn't get on with Nicholas himself. He believes that he should be Tsar in place of Nicholas. He has a bitter feud with the Empress, and instead of commanding the military from St. Petersburg, where the defense ministry, the general staff are all located, he has created this extraordinary headquarters in a town called Mogilov, far away from St. Petersburg, where he's trying to command the entire Western Front entirely by himself. Now, he has the backing of the liberals. He has the backing of some people in the court. He has the backing of much of the media. He is also, unfortunately, as it turns out, completely out of his depth. He doesn't really know how to command a military on this enormous scale. He's apparently a very good tactical commander. He's a sort of person who's able to command, sort of corps, an army corps, but he's absolutely out of his depth in running a large-scale war on the scale that we see being run, being fought, Russia's having to fight on multiple fronts. The other thing is, because he is so closely attuned to the liberals, and because he wants essentially, and many people believe this, Nicholas himself believes this, because he wants to ultimately replace Nicholas as Tsar and hopes to do it with the support of the liberals. He follows liberal political agendas. And the liberals, as we know, are fervid supporters of the alliance with Britain and France. They want to establish a constitutional monarchy in Russia on British lines, and some liberals want to go even further than that. They want to establish a republic on French lines. So they are fervidly pro the British and the French. And what they arranged, and Nikolai Nikolaevich played a huge role in all of this, in 1914, when the German army was advancing on Paris, they got Nicholas Nikolaevich and the army high command, which answers to him, to launch an offensive on eastern Germany. Now, it's known that there were lots of people in Russia who said that the Russian army was not ready to launch an offensive in eastern Germany. That would have meant a complicated rearrangement of military units, and that launching an offensive in eastern Germany would result in a military debacle. What Russia needed to do instead was to concentrate its forces where the Germans were weakest, the Germans and the Austrians were weakest, which was on the Austrian border. Austria, as it turned out, as we discussed in our previous program, as we predicted, if you like, found that Serbia is an extremely difficult nut to crack, that the Serbs have an exceptionally tough army, they're exceptionally tough fighters. The Austrian attempts to capture Belgrade ended in repeated failures. The Austrians were getting bogged down in the fighting against the Serbs in the Balkans. And so the suggestion was that the right thing for the Russians to do was to concentrate their forces against Austria and march on Vienna, and that would have been a far more effective strategy to follow for Russia than an invasion of eastern Germany. And it is in fact the case that the Russian army has advanced into the Habsburg Empire, and it has won a series of decisive victories against the Austrian army, capturing what some people refer to as Western Ukraine, the territory that the Austrians refer to as Galicia, and threatening in effect to march into the Habsburg heartland, which is Vienna. But Nikolai Nikolaevich and the High Command instead insisted on sending this Russian army into eastern Germany against, as I said, much expert advice. And they did that in order to divert German troops from their advance on Paris. That actually was not the case. The Germans didn't have to divert many troops from the Western Front to confront these Russian armies. The German defences were extremely well organised, and in a battle at a place called Tannenberg, these two Russian armies were overwhelmingly defeated and in effect destroyed. And that was a debacle. It got the Russian army to a disastrous start, and despite the huge victories the Russians were winning against the Austrians, the Russians found themselves throughout 1915 on the defensive against the Germans, with the Germans able to advance deep into the Russian Empire and capture cities like Warsaw, which is of course the capital of Poland, and to threaten the entire Russian position in the east. And this was almost entirely a consequence of the way in which the High Command, Nikolai Nikolaevich, the other top military leaders, the liberals in the Duma, the media in Russia, controlled by the liberals, and of course the various business groups have diverted the Russian war effort arguably from away from its correct focus, in order basically to extricate the French and the British out of their problems.
Yeah, but why did Tsar Nicholas buy into this? I mean, I can understand if you have all these forces which are trying to convince him, but at the end of the
Right.
day, you could always make the excuse that he is the Tsar and his word is final. Why did he bow down to all of these various pressures, whether you're talking about the media or Nikolaevich or the Duma, the liberals, whatever it may be? At the end of the day, you know, the buck stops with him, you could say. Why did he allow this to happen?
Well, there is an extremely straightforward explanation for this, and that is that though he is the Tsar, and he does in theory possess autocratic power, he has never succeeded in dominating the government and Russian society to the extent that he needs to. And unfortunately, and I say this because, of course, this is complicating massively Russia's war effort. The fact that Russia is now at war has massively weakened his position. And I'll explain why. And this is directly connected with the way in which the Russian war economy is now being organized. Now, it's important to remember that the liberals are backed by all of these powerful business groups, these oligarchs. And what happened at the start of the war is that, of course, the oligarchs, the business groups, control all the big factories, all the munitions works, all the industrial associations, and all of those sort of things. And at the start of the war, they came together and they formed two so-called voluntary associations, the most important of which is based in Moscow and is headed by a aristocrat, a weak personality, a showcase figure, an individual called Prince Lvov. But he's completely inconsequential. Most people think that the person who's really pulling the strings is a banker called Ryabushinsky. Anyway, the important thing to understand is that these voluntary associations, there's essentially three of them. One is based in Moscow, the other is in St. Petersburg, and there's a third one which is in charge of the agricultural economy. That it is these associations, these voluntary associations, which are controlled by the liberals, by these big industrialists who are connected to the liberals, who run the Russian war economy. And it is they who are providing the armaments, the munitions, the equipment that the Russian army needs in order to fight this war. And this gives the liberals extraordinary influence over the government. So they're able, for example, to insist that their particular military priorities be followed, and that an incompetent figure like the great Grand Prince Nikolai Nikolaevich remain commander-in-chief, even though he is not up to the job. And they've also done something else, which is with the backing of these voluntary associations. They've also created a bloc of liberal MPs, liberal members of parliament, liberal members of the Duma, which is called the so-called Progressive Bloc. And this is various liberal figures, and it's known that they have the tacit support of the Speaker of the Duma, Mr. Rodzianko, who, as I said, is known to be on friendly terms with the Grand Prince Nikolai Nikolaevich, and also with Guchkov. And what these people are agitating is that the Tsar grant this so-called progressive bloc, these liberal figures backed by the Duma. They're agitating that they should be granted positions within the government, that they should in effect gain control of the government. Now, of course, if that happens, they then intend to leverage that position, not just to gain control of the government, but in effect to displace the Tsar himself. And they're running at the same time a massive propaganda campaign against the Tsar and the Tsar's ministers especially the Tsar's prime minister, a man called Goromykin, in order to try to undermine the Tsar's government and to try to get the progressive bloc leveraged into power. So what has been happening is that Nicholas has been trying to sort of keep these people at a distance. It's known that, quite apart from his feelings, that this is not the time for these kind of massive constitutional changes. He's also seen people like Guchkov, Milyukov, another important politician. He's seen that he's apparently unimpressed by their abilities, and he's probably right about that, by the way. He also thinks that they're extremely corrupt, which many of them, by the way, are. He also, I think, quite rightly, doubts that they have the support across the country that they believe they do. So he's been trying to keep them away from the centre of power, but this is absorbing all his energies and all of the energies of the government, and it doesn't give him time or space to basically gain control of the whole government. But of course he did do one thing, which is that he did eventually sack Nikolai Nikolaevich and appoint himself commander-in-chief in place of Nikolai Nikolaevich. And predictably, the moment he did that, there was an extraordinary outcry. The Liberals went absolutely furious about this. They said that Nicholas was absolutely the wrong person to run things, to run the military system. Nikolai Nikolaevich, as I said, was then packed off to the Caucasus, where he took charge of the military there. He's done reasonably well, by the way. As I said, he's not bad as a corps commander. But the other thing that has, I think, infuriated the Liberals even more is that as soon as Nicholas himself assumed the role of commander-in-chief, he replaced a lot of Nikolai Nikolaevich's people with much more capable officers, notably a new chief of staff, General Alexeyev. And one result is that whilst 1915 for Russia was a year of military disaster, 1916 has been a year of victory. They've managed to turn the military situation round. So, and that, of course, in a curious kind of way, has incensed the Liberals even more, because the very last thing they want to see is Nicholas asserting himself, appearing the victorious leader of a victorious country, because that would entrench his position, consolidate it in the future, and might weaken the Liberals' bid for power. But the result is, again, you see an extremely dysfunctional situation, a situation on the home front where the government doesn't have full control of the war economy, isn't able to exert itself effectively, and where military decisions have been made which have been extremely bad, because though Nicholas always felt, it seems, that Nikolai Nikolaevich wasn't the right man for the job, he had for a very long time, he felt unable for a very long time to sack him, and when he did eventually sack him, it cost him an enormous amount of criticism, which, having said that, he's managed to ride out.
Right. So what you have in this case is you have the liberals working with the oligarchs. The oligarchs control the war infrastructure.
Yes.
And they were looking to leverage that control into more government positions.
Yes.
That's pretty much what's going on here.
Absolutely. And there's been a number of incredibly bitter battles within the Council of Ministers and in the Duma. There's relentless criticism of the government from within the Duma. There's incredible things being circulated. There was an utterly bizarre, in fact, ludicrous article which appeared, which suggested that Nicholas was an insane driver of the car. You're comparing him to an insane driver of a car who was driving a car off a cliff and things of that kind. There's been a sustained attack on Nicholas at almost every level of, the media, the Duma, and it should be said there are some members of the government themselves who are under a lot of pressure. Some of them perhaps have also been bribed. I mean, Russia has that, those sort of weaknesses as well. And within the government itself, some of these oligarchs have been able to exert extraordinary power.
Right. It's media, oligarchs, and the liberal legislation all aligned to get control of the country.
Indeed, I mean exactly. They're leveraging the war and their control of the economy to extract political concessions from the Tsar, with the ultimate intention of displacing him. I mean, that is basically what is going on in Russia at the moment, and they are doing so in the facile belief that they are more popular in the country than he is, and they're going to provide a better leadership from the country than he does. And I think pretty much every outside observer, everybody who's looking at this thing objectively, and who has any real sense with the general feelings of the public, of the population of Russia, realizes that the opposite is true. The idea that the mass of the Russian people would prefer to be led by people like Guchkov, Milyukov, all of these other Nekrasov, all of these other people, all these sort of people, that it's more likely to be preferred to be led by people like that than by the Tsar. I think nobody who really understands the situation in Russia believes it, except these people themselves. And of course, they have a lot of power because they control the war economy. They also control the media, and they've made the government's position extremely difficult.
Right. It's not so much about winning the war. The war is just a tool for them to get more, to get political power outright. It's not
exactly.
It's not about the war. It's about using it as leverage in order to get control of Russia, and that's why changes had to be made. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. The other problem, and this is another problem which Nicholas has, is he can't find people he can rely upon to run the civil administration. I mentioned Goromikin, who was the prime minister, but of course Goromikin is an old man. He's a decent, loyal, capable man, but nobody believes that he has the energy and the force of personality to run the government effectively in wartime. The most obvious person to take charge is the agriculture minister, a man called Krivoshein, a very close associate of Stolypin's, and he's widely considered to be the most capable man in the government. But Krivoshein doesn't want to take the job, and the reason he doesn't want to take the job is because he doesn't want the responsibility of running the government, and he is also apparently open to some of the pressure from the liberals. So we have this weakness at the centre of power as well. Nicholas, unfortunately, one of the consequences of this is, as I said, he's found some very capable and very talented generals. But as a result, because he's finding that he's able to work with his generals more with his civilian politicians, he is increasingly neglecting the home front, the situation, the civilian situation, to deal with that part of the war which is more amenable to him, which is the military side. And I think that most people who look at this objectively think that he took the right decision to sack Nikolai Nikolaevich and to assume command himself. He took the, I think, mistaken decision of leaving St. Petersburg, or Petrograd as it's now called, and going to Nikolai Nikolaivich's former headquarters at Mogilov, quite a long distance away from St. Petersburg, because, of course, he's more comfortable there with the generals, with people like Alexeyev, Brusilov, another very capable general, people like that, than he is with all of these characters like Rodzianko, Guchkov, and all the rest in St. Petersburg, in Petrograd. So, unfortunately, that I think is weakening the situation at the centre. Nicholas doesn't like intrigues. He doesn't like intriguers. And it's understandable at a human level why he wants to distance himself from them. And of course, he realizes how intractable the situation at the centre, in the capital, politically intractable, the situation has become. But one gets the sense that he just wants to wash his hands of it. And I'm afraid that might not be a sensible option. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, by removing his presence, his actual physical presence from the location of government is going to leave a vacuum.
Yes.
I mean, you have to physically be present in order to govern, especially at times like these, or at least have someone capable like Stolypin to exert that authority on your behalf. Yeah.
And he's not found anybody to do that. He doesn't have a person like that. Goromikin is not up to that kind of job.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a big mistake. Yeah. Where is Lenin in all of this?
Right. Lenin is in Switzerland. He's agitating against the war. He says that the Russian people should convert the world war into a civil war. This is their opportunity to overthrow the government. He senses weakness. He's well aware of the political crisis in the capital, about the fact that the government is becoming increasingly divided, that the Tsar is becoming distracted, that his position is getting weaker, and he is trying, as I said, to engineer a crisis within Russia. Now, I think everybody who's looking at the situation agrees that Lenin can't do this by himself. I mean, he has a very, very well organized organization across Russia. He has some extremely tough activists working for him at the grassroots, especially in the factories in St. Petersburg. There's a man there, one of his people, called Shliapnikov, who is a worker, and he's well known to be an extremely tough organizer. There's another man called Skryabin, who is also, working class background, and he's also active in St. Petersburg at the moment. Skryabin is increasingly using, by the way, one of these alternative revolutionary names. He calls himself Molotov, the Hammer. Anyway, he's a very tough character. So Lenin has these people, and they're not just in St. Petersburg. He has people like that in Moscow. He has people in the Urals, in the Donbass, in all sorts of places. In Nikolaev, where the shipbuilding industries are located, in Baku, where the oil industry is. He's got people everywhere. But even though they're well organized in the factories, he doesn't have that political presence in the Duma. And of course, he doesn't have people that he can run in the army and in the security services. So he's not, I think, able by himself to precipitate an existential political crisis for the monarchy. But if such a crisis were to take place, he is extremely well positioned to take advantage of it. And his people on the ground are busy spreading defeatist propaganda through the factories, pointing out that the situation, that this war, doesn't benefit Russian workers, telling them that, the enemy is the Tsar, the enemy is the bosses, preparing them for the moment when they'll come out onto the streets and bring about the revolution, which will bring Lenin and his party to power. Now, if I can come back to the liberals and the oligarchs that back them, once more, one senses that they're doing Lenin's work for him, because on the one hand, they're allowing all of these activists to operate in the factories. At the same time, They've never shown any real interest in improving working conditions in the factories and in the various places. I mean, if you see the conditions that workers have to live in Petrograd, I mean, it can be pretty grim. And that, of course, makes these workers extremely angry. But they're doing something else which I think is exacerbating the situation, which is that because they're not working in harness with the government, they are in effect undermining the government. They are neglecting one absolutely essential part of a properly functioning war economy, which is providing food to the cities. Russia has a very it doesn't have the kind of dense railway network that you find in places like Germany and Britain and France. So it's not easy to move things around the country particularly easily. Russia is a major food producer, so there's no shortage of food in the country. But because the oligarchs are interested primarily in winning support from people in the military, what they're doing is they're prioritizing the supply of munitions to the army over the supply of food to the cities. And at the same time, they're not helping the government set up a properly functioning ration system to make sure that workers and their families have reliable food supplies. So the result of all of this is you're having a steadily plummeting food situation in the cities. And of course, nobody seems to know what to do about it. At least there's plenty of people who know what to do about it. But because of all the infighting and of all the intriguing, and with Nicholas away in Mogilov, far from the action in the capital, nothing actually is being done. And the oligarchs doing all of this is, of course, in some ways working to Lenin's advantage, because Lenin is able to say to the workers, look, this war is a disaster for you. Your living standards are falling. Things are becoming more and more difficult for you. This is a war of the bosses. This is an imperialist war. You've got no real role in it. Your brothers and sisters are the people in Germany and France. Let's all unite together. Let's convert this world war, this capitalist war, into a civil war and use it to overthrow the monarchy and the government and to establish our new socialist state. And it's gaining traction. There are, with people like, Skriabin, Molotov, the Hammer, and Shliapnikov working hard to spread these ideas. People like Beloborodov and Goloshchokin in the Urals doing all of these things for Lenin. As I said, he has extremely tough activists and organizers in the factories. With all of this going on, this message is being circulated and it is being heard. And the government isn't able, it seems, to respond to it, and the oligarchs aren't interested.
Yeah. How can they respond when the Tsar is so far away as well?
Well, how can they
work? It doesn't work.
How can they respond? But remember, the liberals are not interested in what people like Shliapnikov and Skriabin, the Hammer, are up to in the factories, even though that's potentially the most dangerous thing. They want to use these people. They don't mind protests. They like protests, provided they think they can control them, because that puts more pressure on the Tsar and on the government. But they're not really concerned about that. Their primary focus is displacing the Tsar, gaining control of the government, leveraging their control of the war economy to basically gain control of Russia. They think that if they can gain control of Russia, well, they'll be so popular that people like Lenin, well, they don't need to worry about him. I think they are completely misjudging the situation. And I think that if they were to get what they wanted, if they really were able to displace the Tsar, if they were able to use, say, a protest wave to get him to step down or to step aside or to move aside, I think they would very quickly find that they've set a tiger loose that they simply can't control. But that's their strategy at the moment.
Yeah, just on a final note, I mean, the Tsar's kind of displaced himself in a way. I mean, by taking the action and going to Mogilov.
Yeah.
That's the essential problem in all of this is there's all these factions that want power and they want to displace the Tsar. And he's removed himself in a way,
Yes.
physically.
Yes.
He's left the seat of power to
Yes.
go deal with a front against Germany that they shouldn't be dealing with to begin with.
Well, exactly. Yeah, quite so. Quite right. I mean, can I just say, I mean, everybody accepts that since he took over, the performance of the military has improved dramatically. Professional people are in charge. The military, as I say, in many places is extremely well organized. The soldiers are very tough and very good. The officers in many places are outstanding. Contrary to what many people think, Russia has some extremely good military equipment. There's a very talented engineer, designer called Igor Sikorsky, who is building bombers. Russia is the first country in the world to operate strategic bombers, large-scale aircraft bombers. I mean, things that the Germans and the British don't have. So, they've got lots going for them there. But he's run away from the real problems which are in his capital and amongst the political class. He's sick of them. He's exhausted by them. He doesn't have the force of personality to dominate them. I mean, just imagine a Peter the Great or even an Alexander III in this kind of situation, his father. They would never have let themselves be put in this kind of situation. But Nicholas does. I'll give one example of the extent to which he's run away. Now, he was persuaded to come to the Duma and to make his presence there. And he did in fact go. He's been once to the Duma over the course of the war. And many of the MPs, because not all of them are hostile to him, many of them were enthusiastic in receiving him. But he said nothing. He didn't actually utter a word. He was completely silent. He didn't give a lead. He didn't give people any sense of inspiration and encouragement, because he's so exhausted by all the intrigues and all the corruption and so disgusted by it that, as I said, he's just run away from it and doesn't seem to understand that that's the true point of weakness. He can leave people like Alexeyev to run the war, the fighting. They'll do that extremely effectively. They don't need him to do it. He needs to be in his capital, running the government, taking charge, talking to people, bringing them together, organising things effectively so that food is provided to the cities, munitions is provided to the troops, and at the same time there's a clear lead given to the people of the country and a clear explanation to them of why Russia is at war. We've said many things about Nicholas. In many respects, as we've said many times, he's much tougher than people realise. He's got a very tough streak. He keeps going in the face of tremendous adversities. He's a charming man. He's a highly educated man. He's extremely well informed about the situation. He loves his country and he's intelligent. But he is diffident and shy. And at a time like this, that's not what Russia needs.
And he doesn't enjoy administering. He doesn't enjoy the managerial part and the administration part of government, which is all the more reason why, one, the Stolypin assassination was so lethal, and number two, he should have put an emphasis on finding 1, 2, 3 very good replacements in order to help him administer and manage.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's that simple. He doesn't enjoy it. He doesn't enjoy it. No. He doesn't like it. Maybe he's not good at it. and he
Yes.
runs away to do things where he's more comfortable.
Yes.
But you don't leave the seat of power at a time of such turmoil and such uncertainty. You have to
Absolutely.
stay in your base.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that he's done, by the way, and I think many people would agree, is that he has completely disorganized the most important part of his own governmental machine, which is the Interior Ministry. I mean, he had a whole succession of people appointed to the Interior Ministry, including an extraordinary character called called Khvostov, who, as many people consider him to be, a borderline psychopath. Now, Khvostov was appointed and very quickly dismissed when it became obvious that he wasn't up to the job. But the fact of the matter is, you need a tough person in charge of the Interior Ministry. You need people who can run the police and the security services effectively, especially in wartime. But as you rightly say, Nicholas fundamentally doesn't like this sort of thing. It's not part of what he likes at all. He's intelligent, he's well-meaning, he's well-educated, he's tough, he's able to make strong decisions. But he doesn't know whom to pick, and he doesn't like to deal with and face down the kind of political challenges that are building up around him. So the result is that we see that the situation in the capital, it's now called Petrograd, by the way. They changed the name when the war began from St. Petersburg. They changed it to Petrograd because that sounds more Russian. He, instead of staying in Petrograd and making sure that he's in full control of the situation and facing down people like Rodzianko and Guchkov and all the rest, telling them, go away, I'm the person in charge. Instead of chairing cabinet meetings, instead of taking real interest in questions of supply, for example, he's just letting the whole situation drift. We see bad decisions being taken with the war economy, for example. We see that, for example, Russian shipyards are still building battleships which have no real role in the war, and steel and copper and heavy equipment which ought to be used to make shells and guns for the army are being diverted to build these battleships which have no real value. And again, the reason that is happening is because, of course, Nicholas himself isn't in a position, doesn't really want to involve himself with these sort of decisions. He isn't saying, enough, let's stop. What are our priorities? And in his absence, and without anyone else, without Stolypin, there's no one else to make that decision for him. You're absolutely right in what you said. In our previous programs, that the assassination of Stolypin has deprived Nicholas of his key partner. When Nicholas and Stolypin were working together, they made a formidable team. But without Stolypin, Nicholas looks lost.
Yeah. All right. We will leave it there. Everybody, theduran.locals.com. Take care.